Easily the most frightening experience I ever had was back when I was in the 5th grade. I remember everything about it actually. I was walking to school and it was unusually dark outside. The sky was completely overcast with the darkest clouds I'd ever seen in my life. I did have my umbrella with me just in case it was going to rain, but I made it to school before that happened. I have to admit to being very distracted that day. I spent most of my time looking out the window. The teacher had to call my name several times to get my attention, on more than one occasion as well. I couldn't help it though. There was something very different about the way the approaching storm seemed to me. There was something about it I'd never really noticed in any other storm. I just wasn't really sure what that was. It began to rain quite fiercely about a half hour before lunch. The dark sky was lit up several times by strikes of lightning, and cracks of thunder drowned out my teacher's voice. I was quite mesmerized by what was happening. I'll always remember this part quite vividly. The bell that signified it was time for lunch sounded out. My teacher got up and told us to line up at the door. No sooner than I had gotten up from my desk though, I heard the drill alarm begin to go off. Or at least what I thought was the drill alarm. Immediately, all the kids in line began to panic. I think we all assumed there was a fire. But I guess in hindsight, that didn't make much sense, since the rain was falling so hard. The principal's voice suddenly came over the intercom. He informed us that this was not a drill, and it was not a fire either. A tornado warning had just been sounded. We were instructed to go out into the hallway, just as we'd always done when we had tornado drills. Unfortunately, the words of the principal didn't do anything to calm anyone down. Kids were pushing each other out of the way. Everyone was in a hurry to be the first out of the room and into the hallway. It was pretty bad. The teacher was trying desperately to get everyone to calm down. It wouldn't work, and from the sounds of what was happening, it was not working in any of the other classrooms either. I remember I tried pushing through the other kids as well. When I finally got out into the hallway, it was utter chaos. Kids were scrambling around. Some were up against the wall in their tornado drill stands, sitting down, putting their head down in their lap and putting their arms over their heads. But unlike the drills, it was not orderly at all. Kids were taking up more space than they needed to. There wasn't enough room for everyone. I didn't want to create a problem myself, so I found a spot on the wall, dug in, and put my head down. I'm not sure how long I sat there like that before it happened. It was loud. Kids were scrambling. The damn tornado alarm was still going off. And then a new sound joined them. It was a surreal, very loud sound, almost like being right in front of a train. I was on the verge of tears because I knew this was the tornado I had been hearing. Well, the sound only got louder and louder. I had this overpowering urge to look up and see. I knew I wasn't supposed to. I was trying to follow the rules, but it was just too loud to resist. Finally, I lifted my head to look up. Right when I did, I heard the most horrible crashing sound. I can't even begin to describe it. I watched as the side of the school was torn right open before my very eyes. I couldn't see a funnel or anything, but I knew the tornado was slamming into the school just down the hallway in front of me. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. For some reason, it crossed my mind that if I simply put my head back down and covered up, it would all be all right. I mean, if the adults tell you this is the way to protect yourself, what else can you do? So that's what I did. It was horrible, listening to the sounds of the tornado, hearing children screaming in despair, and hearing the school being torn apart. Throughout all of it, I tried my best to keep my head down and keep myself locked in place. I don't know how long that lasted, but it seemed like forever. Eventually, the noise died down. The tornado was gone. I waited, still scared, until a teacher tapped me on my shoulder and told me it was okay to get up. The area where the tornado had hit the school had been absolutely obliterated. If you've never been in a tornado before, I know a lot of people have said they really want to see one, but really, I don't think you do. I don't know what the hell is going on with this clown thing, but whatever it is obviously not good. Probably just a bunch of people messing around, but still, it's pretty freaky. I had my own experience recently. I was hanging out with my best friend Todd. We were pretty psyched up that Halloween was coming soon. We actually wanted to start a YouTube channel that we used to do ghost haunts. I mean, what's a better time on Halloween than doing something like that? We tried to decide what would be the best setting for our very first episode. We decided to do a graveyard, of course. Some graveyards have gates around them. Some might have caretakers or other various defenses against grave robbers. We wanted to make sure that when we finally went out and made our video, we wouldn't have any interruptions at all. Of course, the only way to find the perfect graveyard to film in at night was to look for one at night. There were plenty of graveyards in our area, so we scattered about a few a night for 3 nights in a row. We hadn't found any that we really wanted to use, though. I mean, some of them were accessible, but we didn't just want accessible. We wanted it to be both accessible and spooky. The 4th graveyard we scouted was alright. I won't say it was perfect, and actually we didn't end up choosing it for our video in the end, but there's another reason for that. Todd and I were looking through the graveyard when we noticed another light just up ahead of us. Immediately I got worried. I thought this must be the caretaker or something, and we were about to get in trouble. I told Todd we needed to leave right now. Todd, however, was a lot more adventurous than I was. He decided surely it was not a caretaker. It was probably some high school kids hanging out in the graveyard, telling ghost stories or smoking a bong or something. Todd thought we should try to check it out and see if it really was teenagers. If it was the perfect chance to sneak up on them and scare the living daylights out of them. Against my better judgment, I decided to go along with this. We tried to get up close to them to see what we could see. As we got closer, though, we saw the light was likely coming from a crackling fire. That wasn't the part that froze us in fear. We could see there were 5 clowns, holding hands and circling the fire. I hadn't ever seen anything like that before. The first thing I thought was it seemed like some sort of weird cultish ritual. Fortunately for us, we were in the dark, and the clowns circling the fire couldn't see us, or so it seemed. I knew that we should get the hell out of there, but it was so hypnotic just watching them do this ritual. It was Todd who suggested we leave, actually, so we did. We were very quiet. I had no idea what those clowns were doing. I have no idea if they would have meant us any harm, but just try to picture what we saw that night. 5 clowns, all dancing around a fire in a graveyard silently. Pretty freaky, huh? It kinda sucks that we were just scouting that night and didn't have our video camera with us. That would have made a very interesting first video. My brother used to tell me there was a witch who lived in the woods just behind our house. My brother was 8 years old at the time, and 8-year-olds are definitely more likely to believe in such things. At 14, though, I didn't believe in witches. I figured either he was just scared of the dark outside his bedroom window, or he'd seen something and mistaken it for a witch and let his imagination go crazy. He, however, always insisted it was truly a witch. I'm an indoors boy myself. I have no problem with that now, and I had no problem with that when I was a teenager, so I never had a reason to go back into those woods. Once, when I was babysitting my little brother, though, I did a pretty bad thing. I invited my best friend Terry over, and we were playing video games. I completely took my attention off of my little brother because of this. Early into the evening, I heard some noise coming from the backyard. Terry and I rushed to the door, only to see my little brother there. He was sobbing, saying he'd been out in the backyard when the witch had emerged out of the woods. She'd tried to coax him into coming to play with her. My brother, his name Patrick, had refused. He said he knew better than to go with strangers. He then claimed that the witch got angry and began to come towards him while cursing him. That's when Patrick ran up to the door and the witch disappeared. I felt like a jerk. I really should have been paying more attention. but I tried to explain to Patrick that there was no such thing as a witch. Surely he'd seen a stranger and thought they were a witch. He seemed very upset that I didn't believe him. Right then, my best friend Terry challenged me to go into the woods if I was so confident that witches didn't exist. I tried to decline. Of course, he began to call me a chicken, and now, suddenly feeling brave, Patrick joined in and began to mock me as well. So, of course, I said I would because there was nothing to be afraid of. Patrick and Terry followed me to the forest. The dare was that I would walk 50 yards in before I came back out. I had no idea how to measure that myself, but I figured I could just guesstimate. I slowly walked into that dark forest. I tried to keep a brave front, but it was just a bravado. I was actually really scared. It was pretty dim outside, and I didn't have a flashlight either. It would have been easy for the light to play tricks on my eyes. I'm not sure how deep I'd gotten into the woods when I saw something that truly scared the crap out of me. There seemed to be a small clearing just up ahead of me. There was nobody there, but I could see 5 or 6 old dolls laying on the ground. Some of them were dismembered, with their body parts strewn about the clearing. There were these strange symbols carved into the trees as well. I can't really describe because I'm not sure exactly what they were. I can't say they were witchcraft symbols without knowing what those are, and I wasn't scared there was a witch in the woods either. But the fact there was indeed someone out there acting weird meant it was pretty likely my brother had actually been enticed into the woods by someone, witch or not. This freaked me out pretty badly. I definitely wasn't going to tell my little brother about it though. That would scare him way too much. I grabbed one of the dolls to show to my best friend as proof. I hid it under the back of my shirt when I came back out. I insisted there was no one in the woods and nothing to be scared of, which made Patrick feel really relieved. Later in my bedroom though, I showed my best friend that doll as proof. He thought it was pretty awesome. Afterwards, I took it and threw it in the garbage can on the back porch. Later that night, I was doing some homework when I suddenly heard a noise. It sounded like a raccoon had gotten into the trash can. Annoyed, I walked over to the back porch and turned on the lights. I gasped as I saw a large woman. She must have been 6 feet tall, standing naked on the back porch. The lid to the trash can was off, and in her hand she was cradling the doll I had thrown in the garbage. The light seemed to have caught her by surprise. As I shined the light in her face, she looked at me, and I saw the craziest eyes I'd ever seen. Before I could react at all, the woman took off sprinting into the woods. I had to call the police about what happened. I didn't care that she'd gone through the garbage to get her doll, but I now fully believed what Patrick had been telling me. This was that witch, and if that woman was trying to entice him into the woods that day, she would come back again in the future. The police found her in the woods and took her away. I hope to a psychiatric ward to get some help or something. I don't know much more about why she was out there, but I'll never get that picture of her that night out of my head. Almost a year ago, I was an opener at a resort, clocking in before 5 a.m. each day. The resort is located inside an affluent neighborhood in a very wealthy town/suburb. Employees had to park in one of 2 parking lots at either ends of the property. The lot I chose was adjacent to a long and winding road outside the resort, which led to the rest of the neighborhood. The road and resort were separated by a short range of brush and trees that no one ever walked through. I'd arrived one morning as per usual and put my car into park with my headlights still on. The lights of the lot weren't ever on in the morning, since no one else really showed up before 6 a.m. when the sun was out. It was usually always pitch dark at the start of my walk because of this. Save for security, I was one of the first employees to arrive on the property each morning and was usually completely alone in this particular lot at this time as well. This morning didn't seem to be any different. I had my hand literally on my keys, my brain in the process of turning off my car, when I noticed what seemed to be a young girl, maybe 14 or 15 years old, come scampering through the span of trees that separated the resort from the outside road. She was directly in front of my car, and my headlights illuminated a clear view of her in the pitch black. She looked like she was in high school, had long blonde hair, and seemed to be wearing pajamas maybe, like she'd just left her house or something. The thing that bothered me most about her, though, was that she would not stop laughing and giggling like a maniac. I could hear her laughing from outside the car. She was visibly laughing at something I wasn't aware of or could not see. It looked so unnatural. She would occasionally glance at different areas, as if somewhere else were there waiting just outside my headlights. She waved at me as if it were a normal gesture, and then ran to my passenger side door. This happened in a matter of seconds. I wasn't even really sure what was happening, and my anxiety was spiking. I simultaneously yanked the aux from my phone to shut whatever song had been playing off, while grabbing my lock button. I remember feeling panic for not remembering if I'd locked the doors. The girl began to violently pull on the door handle and slam on my passenger side window. I realized because I hadn't turned the car off yet, they'd stayed locked. She continued to slam against the window, seemingly trying to break it. I was screaming at the top of my lungs for her to leave before pressing down on my horn. I could see her start laughing hysterically, like this were some type of game, as if I were just a friend not letting her in as a joke or something. After a few seconds, she stopped slamming my window and began to try and open the car door once more. Her face instantly fell flat, like I'd disappointed her. She started to walk away from my car, back into the bushes from where she came. She waved at me once more, before squeezing in between the trees and back into the darkness, out of view of my headlights. The entire encounter confused me, almost as much as it scared me. Most people I've told the story to chalked it up to her being on drugs, but that narrative doesn't feel right to me, despite her odd behavior. Maybe she was just being an extremely out-of-touch teenager whose parents need to get a firmer grip on her or something. I told someone when I made it to LP, but they didn't seem to care much. I didn't call the police either, and I kinda regret that. I'll never get out of my brain, though, how fucking off the feeling was, watching this stranger alone in the darkness pop out of the trees laughing, then violently trying to break into my car in an empty lot. I think the possibility of someone else being present in the darkness the whole time is scary too. I wonder if someone else really was there, and where they were exactly if they were. I work at a higher-end women's clothing store in my state's largest mall. We're also seriously understaffed, and generally only have one manager and one associate on at all times. This will be important for later. This incident happened 2 weeks after I was promoted to manager. It was my first night closing the store as the manager on duty, and I was already nervous because of this, even though I'd had weeks of training already. A few hours into my shift, my store manager asked me to hang a banner in the front window, promoting some sort of sale. I asked my associate Allie to help me out, because the sign was very heavy and hard to put up by myself. It took about 20 minutes of struggling to get that damn thing set up, but eventually we did it. As I was cleaning up the supplies I'd needed to do this, I locked eyes with a man outside the store. The man was sitting on the bench in the middle of the corridor my store was in, seemingly talking on his phone. No big deal. People are always out there. Probably he was just waiting for someone. Our store was between a popular bra store and a well-known coffee chain, easy landmarks for people unfamiliar with our mall. I gave the man a quick smile and continued on my way. An hour later, though, Allie rushed up to me and told me the same man was still sitting on the bench outside on his phone. That raised a bit of a red flag for me. The mod is always supposed to be near the front of the store, but being so understaffed, managers are always running back and forth from the front to the back where the registers are. I happened to be helping ring someone out when she told me this. In the last few months, we'd had a few people grab piles of clothes off the table at the front of the store and try to run out. Because of this, I was wary. I casually walked to the front to fold some sweaters and keep a close eye on this suspicious man. And that's when things took a turn for the strange. As I got close to the door, I could hear the man saying on his phone, I'm sure I can get one, but I might be able to get two. One's coming now. Bye. My mind was still thinking this guy was gonna grab some clothes and run, since I had my back turned. Instead, he jumped up, walked just outside the doors, and gave me the biggest, friendliest smile he could muster. Excuse me, miss, could you come here for a second? I want to show you something. Come out here with me, just for 1 minute. I was now getting super creepy vibes from this guy. Sorry, sir, I'm the manager on duty. I can't leave the store at all. I backed up a few feet. Shucks, I just wanted to show you how wonderful your sign looks from outside. I saw you ladies struggling to put it up earlier. I wanted to offer my help, but I knew it was probably against the rules. I understand being friendly, but this guy was being overly friendly. I could feel he was trying to charm me. Oh, thank you. Those signs are heavy and can be quite a pain to put up. The man walked into the store. I gave him a weak smile and backed up towards the middle of the store to straighten things up, while still keeping an eye on him. I looked for my coworker, only to see she'd disappeared into the back room. So much for power in numbers, I guess. He started to randomly wander around, looking at different items, checking the tags, clearly pretending to be browsing. As he got towards the back of the store, my store manager came out of the back room. She started talking about schedules and meetings, so she was clearly the one in charge of everything. He saw her and made his way towards the exit. I was still at the front, but had wedged myself between a table and two mannequins. You're doing a great job out here. You lovely ladies have a wonderful evening. The man tipped his hat and ran off. My manager was on her way to the doors when I jumped in front of her to explain everything. I had seen just about every side of her, but I've never seen her look concerned as she looked when I told her that. Being the no-nonsense type of person she was, she told me she was going to go ask him why he was trying to lure me out of the store. She walked out the door, looked toward the direction he'd walked away, and came back to tell me he was now standing in a spot I wouldn't be able to see him unless I walked out of the store. Unfortunately, she couldn't stay with us any longer, as she had an appointment she needed to see to. She told us to call security immediately if the man appeared again. As luck would have it, 30 seconds later, 2 guards were passing by my store. I flagged them down and explained everything. They were clearly concerned as well, which surprised me. They said there'd been reports of suspicious people trying to lure a young woman out of the mall. They started walking toward the direction the man was in to have a chat with him. 5 minutes later, one guard came back and asked me if a man sitting further down the corridor was the same man. It was. He wasn't too close, but was still close enough to come back when he had the chance. At this point, I was about to have a panic attack and almost started crying. The guard stayed a close distance from my store for the rest of the night. Luckily, the man left after. I think the security spooked him off. I called my husband and had him walk Allie and I to our cars after work. As I recounted the story to my husband, I realized something. The man was wearing a zip-up sweatshirt with large pockets, and he had his hands in the whole time this transpired. I firmly believe that if I'd walked out the store, he would have pulled a concealed weapon on me to try to get me to leave the mall quietly. Deep down, I know if I was stupid enough to walk out, I never would have walked back in again. I have a recurring dream. Well, it's more of a recurring concept dream, and the dream itself is not the same, but what happens in it always is. I'll be somewhere with any person, usually a different person each time. It will be really cloudy outside. I'll look off into the distance and see a tornado touch down. I'll panic, and this is the funny part. Each time I see the tornado, I'll remember that I'm having a recurring dream about tornadoes. I'll tell myself this time is not a dream. I run off and try to find a basement to hide in. I've been having this dream over and over for my whole life. What makes this story so weird is that it happened in December. It was December 21st, 2013 to be precise. I was moving into a house with my sister as my roommate. It took place in Tennessee on the very day of the move. We were pretty upset that it was supposed to be a rainy day, so we tried to get all of our loading done before it began to rain. We were actually pretty fortunate that we were able to get everything done with no more than a sprinkling hitting us. We were only about an hour and 20 minutes away from the place we were moving to, so it was supposed to be a pretty quick job. It was unusually warm that day, so far it was not a really unpleasant experience. Probably about 5 o'clock in the evening though, we were in our house with our pets. My sister has 4 cats, a dog, and I had a ferret. We were sorting through things when my phone began to make a noise I was unfamiliar with. I picked it up, and when I looked down, I was shocked to see a tornado warning. I was not too concerned, however. Although I've never had one on my phone before, I've had tornado warnings happen. I've never actually seen a tornado myself. I guess the reason it shocked me so much was that it was odd to get a tornado in December. We went ahead and gathered the pets into the living room with us. We had a basement, but you had to go outside and around to the backyard to get into it. I had the key ready just in case I had to do this. It then began raining really hard, and I mean really hard. My cell phone made another urgent warning again. It told us to immediately take shelter. There were several loud cracks of thunder, and then the weirdest thing happened. Almost immediately, the rain stopped altogether. There was no more thunder, and it was eerily quiet. I was familiar with that calm before the storm thing in regards to tornadoes, but when it actually happened, it was so strange and unnerving. We were about to gather the pets up and rush down to the basement when the silence was broken by an immediate deafening crash. Then there was a sound I can only describe as a train on steroids. It was very loud, and the thunder began to clap again. We decided we could not go outside to the basement at this point. We were concerned the tornado was now too close. The electricity went out altogether, and just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, the entire house began to shake in place. The pets were all scared, and we didn't know what to do. I went over to look out the window. Scared, but still curious to see if there really was a tornado out there. I didn't see it. I couldn't really see anything. It was too dark, and the electricity was out everywhere. I sat in the house with the pets. The noise got louder and louder, and the house began to shake even more fiercely. I was pretty terrified. I began to wonder if we really should have gone into the basement. It was then that very suddenly the noise stopped. The house stopped shaking almost instantly. The lights came back on. It was over just as quickly as it had begun. The whole experience was so surreal. The next morning, I didn't see any other houses that were damaged. There were trees knocked over in the street, but that was the only sign that anything had ever happened. I don't know. I tell you, it was strange that the very day we moved into that house, it had to be hit by a tornado. Just really, really bad luck. There was an old and abandoned asylum right off the town that I live in. Nowadays, it's been cleared out and is used to give ghost tours. I've been to it a couple of times since it reopened. I don't really believe in ghosts, nor do I think it's haunted. And now that it's been cleaned up, it's really nowhere near as scary as it used to be. The reason I know this is I've been in the hospital after it had been closed down for decades, but before it ever reopened as a haunted tour. When I was growing up, we'd heard a lot of stories about the place. They were the sort of stories you would expect from a huge abandoned building that used to house a bunch of crazy people. It probably didn't help that the place was built outside of town, in a heavily forested area. That made it even more creepy than it otherwise would have been. I think this is a pretty common story though, with regards to abandoned hospitals and asylums. You always hear about one patient who was left behind after it closed down. My town, of course, had several of these stories. I recall one of them was about a mentally deranged patient who they referred to as Chuckles. Apparently, the story goes that when the hospital closed down, they had to release all the patients free into the world. Chuckles, however, was so insane that the doctors didn't feel good about unleashing him onto the world, so instead they strapped him down to a gurney, rolled him into a quiet room, and locked him in. From there, the story takes several different directions, depending on who's telling. Some people claim he starved to death because he couldn't unstrap himself, nor could he get out of the quiet room. Others say he did get out and lived by himself in the abandoned hospital. He would roam around in the forest surrounding, finding food to live on. They also claimed he would kidnap kids if they were hiking in the forest, or that if teenagers pulled into the forested area to make out in their cars, Chuckles would appear upon them and kill them. My personal belief was that all of this was obviously total bullshit. One day when I was 15 though, my buddy Eric and I were really bored. He suggested we take a hike through the woods and try to find this old asylum. I was cool with it. Like I said, I didn't believe any of the old stories, so we set out through the woods trying to locate this place. Actually, it didn't take us very long at all. There was an old gravel road that led toward the front gate. The building was huge and covered in graffiti, and the brush was completely overgrown. We assumed that since it was private property, it was likely that there was a caretaker of some sort. If there was, though, we didn't run into him. Eric and I made it through the grounds easy enough and wound up at the building. We were looking for a broken door or perhaps a window so we could get in. Eventually, we came across a window that was covered with a single piece of plywood. We managed to pull the plywood off the window without making too much noise, then lowered ourselves through the window and into a room. As I mentioned before, I've since taken the ghost tour in this building. Nowadays, it's pretty much emptied out. When Eric and I broke in that time, though, it was shocking to us just how unkempt the place was. There were gurneys, wheelchairs, other random hospital equipment that was completely rusty, strewn throughout the rooms and hallways. It almost seemed like when they closed it, they'd just thrown the trash around everywhere. Trust me when I say that when we broke in, it was infinitely creepier than any ghost tour could ever be. They do tours in the dark, but it's not even that bad. There are not only a lot of people around, but there's barely anything in any of the rooms anymore. Plus, all the doors have now been taken down. When we were exploring, though, all the doors were still intact. Many of them were closed and locked. There was tons of garbage and equipment that anyone could be hiding behind. I honestly felt like I was being watched the entire time. I can't recall how long we were in the hospital. We spent a good amount of time exploring, though. Eventually, Eric had gotten a little bit ahead of me while I was exploring what looked to be some sort of operating room. He began shouting at me, telling me he'd just found something extremely urgent. I ran over to him, and he was standing in front of this big door. It seemed heavier than the rest. He was trying to open it when I got there. I saw what had gotten his attention. It was a quiet room. Someone had put graffiti on the door as well, which read Chuckles. Eric was unable to open the door, but it did have a small window in it. He took his flashlight and shined it into the room. He told me to look inside as well. When I did, my heart nearly stopped. In the room was a single gurney with broken straps on the floor. In one of the corners was what appeared to be a long-since dead body. It was decayed beyond belief, but it was definitely a dead person. That sincerely creeped us out, and we left right away. Since then, when we took the ghost tour, the door had been removed. There was no longer any gurney in the room either. What's the most weird, though, is that the tour guide never mentioned anything about Chuckles. You would think they would, since it's a pretty freaky story. They never mentioned that body either. I mean, what's scarier than a person so psychotic he was strapped to a gurney and left to die in the hospital? It gives me shivers even today. This isn't a very long story, but I do think it is very scary. I was out hiking with my girlfriend once, very deep into the woods. We often like to take a vacation and spend a week out camping together. It's quite wonderful, and you rarely run into other people. It kind of makes you think of the sheer size of our planet, that this kind of thing can happen with such a large population. Anyway, we were a couple of days out into our hike when the weather reports failed us. Large black clouds began moving in swiftly over the hills. We had a tent, but it seemed like the storm was going to be pretty violent. We needed to find a place to set up where we would be somewhat protected. Serendipity seemed to be on our side, as we found a cave nearby. We were able to put up our tent right in the mouth of it, and that gave us quite a lot of shelter from the elements. It had begun to rain before we were able to get completely set up though, so we were a little bit wet in the end. We went inside our tent. We figured being a little wet wasn't that big of a deal. We were a bit worried about the severity of the storm though, and what the ground conditions would be like after it was over. We tried to put that out of our minds for a moment though, and get some sleep. All of a sudden, in the middle of the night, my girlfriend began to frantically nudge me, trying to wake me up. When I tried to ask her what was wrong, she quickly put her hand over my mouth and whispered in my ear, "I think there's someone out there." Immediately, I stiffened up. I looked at my watch, only to see it was past midnight. I didn't know why someone would have been out in the storm this long without finding some sort of shelter. It was coming down really hard. I whispered back to her and asked her how she knew this. She whispered that several times she'd seen a light shining through the wall of the tent. It wasn't right up against it, but someone was clearly shining a flashlight from a distance. I rolled over and tried not to make much noise. I wanted to see this light if it were to come back after a short period of time. I soon confirmed what she was talking about. Someone was definitely shining a light into our tent. They weren't moving any closer to us though, just wavering for a few moments, then disappearing. We tried our best to keep quiet. If they'd been someone looking for shelter, the two of us figured they would have come and tried to contact us. Whoever was shining that light was being hesitant for some reason. Either that meant they were nervous, or they were planning something less than desirable. As quickly as I could, I grabbed my hunting knife and made sure it was close to me. I whispered to my girlfriend that I would keep an eye open and an ear available to see if they would come any closer. The light shone through our tent a few times during the night. It was the same way each time as well. It would shine in as though looking at us, waver there for a few moments, then flash away in an instant. It came a little closer once or twice, but never came right up to us. I didn't move, but kept myself ever ready. Sometime after 3 a.m. though, it was gone. I didn't see it again after. When the sun came up, although I hadn't had much rest myself, I figured it might be a good idea for my girlfriend and I to pack up and leave right away. My girlfriend opened up the tent and immediately screamed. I grabbed my knife and rushed over. Lying right outside the door flap was a decapitated and bloodied bird carcass. It was pinned to the ground by a small knife. I felt my heart turn to ice. It seems the person I'd seen with that light had gotten a lot closer than I'd ever thought they did. Because when we set up that tent, we'd set up the opening facing the inside of the cave. Bird watching was an activity I usually enjoyed in the fall and would regularly go hiking in the local forest to do. It was never pleasant to go for hikes in the summer. Too much sweat and too many bugs always made a miserable experience. But the fall was just the perfect time. The scariest thing that ever happened to me occurred when I was on one of these walks. I'd gotten an early start that day and wanted to see how deep I could get out into the hills. Now, it's not unusual to run into people during these hikes. Although the hills around us were rather deep with forest, fall was a popular time to go hiking. This day, I was out in the woods for several hours though, without seeing a single person. I was looking through my binoculars in a cardinal direction when I heard a twig snap not too far behind me. I jumped and spun around. I expected to see a small animal behind me, at worst someone spying on me, but instead, to my surprise, I didn't see anything. I didn't think too much about it because it really could have been anything making that noise. The snapping sound I made spinning around had scared the birds away, so I decided to continue hiking and looking for some other birds to watch. As I was continuing to walk around though, I could have sworn that I heard someone else walking behind me. It was almost like being in a living cartoon. As I was walking, it seemed like I heard an extra set of footsteps, but every time I stopped, I didn't hear anything at all. I was stuck between thinking I was just imagining it and thinking that someone else in the woods was really trying to mess with my mind. This continued for quite a while. Fortunately, I was pretty familiar with the area, so I wasn't more than just a little bit nervous hearing what I assumed were other footsteps. It did wreck my nerves a bit though. By the time I got to this creek I usually stopped by for a drink of water, I was really on edge. I walked into the creek, much happier to be hearing the sounds of flowing water rather than leaves. As I was about to bend down to get a drink, I noticed a bird call from the far side of the creek. While it was the bird that got my attention, it was what was beside the bird that kept it. I could see a human body laying down on the far side of the creek. His head was turned to the side, and he was so thickly dressed I couldn't tell if he was breathing or not. I tried calling out to this person to see if they were alive or unconscious. They didn't answer. If they were alive and I didn't try to help out a bit, I would have felt terrible. I made my way walking down to a log that was crossing the creek and carefully made it to the other side. I cautiously approached the man laying there. As I got closer to him though, I didn't have to get much further to realize that this man was clearly dead. Blood on the rocks and his discolored flesh was more than enough to let me know he'd been dead a while. The way it was arranged made me pretty confident he'd been killed as well. Panicked, I quickly rushed back to the log and crossed back over. I was nervous and missed my footing though. I slipped and fell into the water. Fortunately, it was a shallow creek, and I only needed the log so I wouldn't get wet. I was soaked now though. I got up and trudged out, and began making my way back out of the hills. At first, I was quite panicked, but that soon gave way to worry. I kept remembering the sounds of those footsteps as I'd made my way out of the woods. I began to hear them again, and when I sped up, hurried to get out, I could have sworn I could hear them keeping pace with me. I was convinced that someone was following me the entire time, but the worst part about it was that I could never find trace of them while it was happening, so I didn't know if it was real or all in my head. Regardless, I made it out of the forest without anyone trying to attack me. I had to report that body to the park rangers. I also let them know about me being followed, but I didn't really have any evidence other than my own paranoia to back that up. So, yeah, I have no idea if someone really was after me for seeing that, or if it was just my paranoia from what I'd seen. Either way, it was a pretty terrifying experience. So I had the strangest thing happen to me the other night. I live in an apartment building, in a one-bedroom apartment. The other night, I was in bed sleeping when I heard a loud knocking at my front door. I found this to be very, very odd, because the building I live in has a security door. I don't know anyone else who lives in my building. No one buzzed my buzzer either, so I had no idea who this could be. I got up, stumbling across the floor half asleep. I looked up at the clock and noticed it was around 2 o'clock in the morning. Now I really had no clue what could be going on. I figured maybe one of my neighbors had a problem in their apartment and they needed my help for something. I went up to the front door and grasped onto the chain. I was half asleep, as I mentioned. I realized quickly, though, that it would be pretty stupid to just open the door without even looking through the peephole. I took my hand off the chain and put my eye up to the peephole. I got the shock of my life, and it felt like a real jolt, too. Standing just outside my door was the scariest looking clown I'd ever seen in my entire life. His makeup was evil looking. His mouth makeup had fangs drawn into it. Wounds and blood were made up all over his face. His eyes were narrowed, and he had the sickest smile I'd ever seen. Worst of all, he was pounding on my door with what looked to be a meat cleaver. He loudly knocked on the door again, startling me. I wasn't sure how to react. I mean, obviously, this was freaky. I thought maybe I should just pretend to not be home. I'm not sure how you can even address a clown that looks like such a psychopath. Finally, I decided I needed to say something after he wouldn't go away. I mean, I had no idea who this guy was. If he really started to think I wasn't home, there was nothing stopping him from going to someone else's door, and maybe the next person would open it, and who knows what would have happened to them. I told the guy to go away, or I would call the police. He began to pound on the door even harder. My heart was beating hard in my chest. I told him I was going to call the cops right now. I did so, and went and grabbed my cell phone. When I got back to the door, to my surprise, the clown was still standing there, gazing directly at the peephole. When I returned, he backed away, held the cleaver in the air, and began to spin around in a circle laughing. He danced over to the stairwell, opened the door, and then he was gone. I reported it to the police, of course. It was very terrifying. I'm just glad that nobody got hurt. This happened years ago when I was barely 14. My middle school and the middle school of my best friend at the time organized a trip abroad to Great Britain, London to be exact. It was supposed to be a few days of looking at the London attractions, museums, and shops. It was really fun actually, until it suddenly wasn't. For the day before we were supposed to leave and go home, we were brought to the streets with some interesting shops. We received free time for shopping as well. Our teachers and guide had a brilliant idea. They told us that after the time for shopping had ended, we had to meet them on a different street altogether. In retrospect, it was like 100 meters away, but still. They did that without any of us being familiar with the city. Most of us had never been in London. We barely spoke English either, and didn't have a map of the city. Roaming services didn't work correctly in the area either. 90% of the students got lost. I got lost with my best friend because we went in the complete opposite direction we were supposed to go. We were completely confused and couldn't understand the directions we were being given either. We were walking along the pavement, my friend nervously looking around. I guess we didn't really look like we were together because we weren't really interacting with each other, which is why I guess this happened. My friend ran ahead of me and stopped to look around when a black car suddenly approached me and began to match my speed. I started to feel like this was a scene from a movie or something. It was broad daylight, and there were a lot of people around, but no one seemed to be reacting. I was confused because of this, and I wasn't quite sure what was going on here. Out from the car stepped a man who called out to me, "You look nice, come with me." The man grabbed my arm. The car was still running, so I suppose someone must have still been inside it. I was stunned. I couldn't believe this was really happening. In that moment, my friend ran up from behind, grabbed me, kicked the man in the shin, and dragged me away. We ran and tried to lose that car if it was following us. After some time, we stopped, and my friend nervously cried, shaking me and screaming, "Why didn't I move when the man had tried to catch me?" I explained I was having a deer in the headlights moment. We cooled down and managed to ask someone for help. We were found by our teacher soon after. We didn't tell anyone what happened, and we were sure no one would believe us. After that, when we got back, I told my parents, and I was never allowed to go on a trip organized by my school again. My mom considered all of that really unprofessional and irresponsible, which I guess is fair enough. I had been planning on going on a fishing trip for quite a while. When I got up in the morning, I had everything packed and put into my truck. My boat was secured, and I set out before the sun had even come up. Although I'd checked the weather before I went to bed, and even when I got up, I was a bit surprised when the sun did rise. It was supposed to be overcast and rainy, and it certainly was that day. But what surprised me was just how dark the clouds overhead were. I tried not to let it get me down, though. When you really want to go fishing, rain is one of the last things that will stop you from doing so. I went out on the lake in my boat, and the sky was still pretty dark. I had gotten to the lake and out on my boat before the rain started falling. However, when it did begin to finally fall, it was raining hard. I remember getting slapped by the drops of rain and feeling like the rain was actually physically attacking me. I found the sensation very unpleasant, but it wasn't enough to get me to come off the water. When the sky was positively lit up by the scariest lightning I'd ever seen in my life, though, I decided it might be best to put my fishing trip to an abrupt end. I started the motor and started to head for land. The lake was not very big, so it wouldn't take me very long to get to shore. Getting my boat out of the water in that weather, though, was not going to be fun. Suddenly, though, something caught my attention. I began to hear the strangest sound I'd ever heard. It sounded like a loud and wet crash. That might not be the best way to describe it, but it's the only way I can think of at the moment. I turned around and was absolutely shocked at what I saw in the distance. A small, thin tornado had just touched down right on the surface of the lake. I began to panic. I mean, anybody would. You like to think you'll be calm and act rationally when these things happen, but no, I definitely could not. Hell, I almost wanted to jump out of my boat and swim to shore. Of course, that would have been absolutely stupid. My boat was way faster than I was, but something in my head was just telling me that was logical. Instead of following that thought, though, I kept on heading for shore. I couldn't take my eyes off this sudden waterspout. Every time I looked forward, it was only for a second before I looked back. And yeah, I could see this waterspout was heading right in my direction. As I said, it was not a big lake, so the spout didn't have a lot of places to go. When I'd finally reached the shore, the tornado had made some serious ground on me. I couldn't risk trying to dock my boat. I was just close enough where I could jump out of it and on to the dock. I began to run as fast as I could to my truck and jumped inside. Just as I'd started it up, I saw the scariest thing I'd ever seen. The waterspout rushed over and picked my boat up out of the water as if it were a feather. The boat was thrown through the air before it came crashing down only a few yards away from my truck. I shot the truck into gear and took off. Fortunately, I was able to get away in the end, but that was certainly very scary. Years ago, I committed myself to a psychiatric ward. It wasn't for anything too serious, though. I was having some issues with depression, and I was also having a tough time sleeping. If you've never been in a psych ward before, you may not know what it's actually like. They're, of course, not exactly like what you'd see in the movies. The one I was in was a really clean and well-kept place. The people working there were all super nice as well. I had a nice bed and a room all to myself, and it even had its own private bathroom. The worst thing about being in the psych ward, however, was the complete boredom. Everything is completely organized. You even have a distinct bedtime, too. I know that sort of thing is supposed to be good for people with insomnia problems, but it made it even more difficult for me. I'm very much a night person. I like sleeping in and staying up late. But at 10 p.m., all the patients had to take their medication and go to bed on the dot. Even though they gave me sleeping pills as well, it was pretty aggravating because I couldn't fall asleep so early no matter what I tried. The first few nights were pretty terrible. The medication they gave me was zolpidem. It didn't really help me go to sleep though, and if you know much about this medication, it can also make you hallucinate if you don't fall asleep. I was quite aware of this, but I was having so much trouble with not sleeping that I was willing to risk this. On the third or fourth night that I was there, about an hour after I'd taken the medication, I was still tossing and turning in bed. I turned over and opened my eyes. When I glanced over at my bathroom door, I saw the door slowly begin to open from the inside. It didn't open very much, but it was just enough for me to see most of a face hidden behind the crack in that door. I couldn't make the face out very well, but I could tell it was not anyone I had ever seen before. The person didn't seem to acknowledge me in any way either. I froze at first. My brain was still pretty foggy, but I had enough wherewithal to know that I was likely hallucinating. Rather than freak out and call for someone to help me, I tried to close my eyes and go to sleep anyway. As I laid there, though, I couldn't help but think about that face in the crack of the door. It made it even more difficult for me to fall asleep, but I truly believed it was only a hallucination. I kept my eyes tightly closed. I figured that feeling would go away, and eventually I'd just fall asleep on my own. After a while, though, I realized that something was keeping me from falling asleep. I rolled over on my back and opened my eyes. A sudden shock reverberated throughout my body. The person who'd been in the bathroom was now standing right over me, grinning down at me. I jumped up from being so startled. The person reached down and slapped their hand over my mouth to keep me from screaming. It was right then, when I felt their touch, that I realized this was a real person and not a hallucination. I had only been in the ward less than a week. I figured I must not have known everyone who was there yet. I struggled, but the man was so strong. He held me down firmly, his hand covering my mouth and nose. All I could think to do as this guy began to smother me was to flail around recklessly. I luckily smacked the lamp on the nightstand and knocked it over onto the floor. The loud crashing startled the man, but he still kept his hand firmly over my mouth and nose. Fortunately, though, the crash had attracted the people at the night desk. They rushed into the room and pulled the man off even as he continued to try and smother me. The man just kept staring at me, this time with a stern look on his face as they held him down. While I stood there still in shock, an intern rushed in and sedated the man. I later found out why I'd never seen that particular patient before. He had been spending time isolated for severe behavioral issues. Apparently, he'd just been let out that very same day. I have no doubt he was put back in soon after. I got discharged the very next day. There was no way, with his issues needing to be addressed still, that I could spend another single day there. I know a lot of kids have been bullied growing up. Now that I'm an adult, I have friends who tell me that when they look back, they don't see their experiences being bullied as nearly as bad as they seemed when they were younger. The only sense I can make out of that is that they must not have been bullied nearly as badly as I was. There's no way I can look back on my childhood bully and not think he was the worst person on the planet. My parents tended to move around a lot. Many of the moves were pretty dramatic as well. In most of the places we lived, I had no trouble making new friends. Right before I turned 13, though, my parents moved to a town in rural Tennessee, which was much, much worse. Right away, I began getting tormented by a bully named Gaylord. I guess the only way I could look at him with any sympathy was that his parents had actually named him that. Apparently it was after some sort of baseball pitcher, so he claimed. I have nothing against gay people myself, but it was a very strange name. I couldn't imagine, though, that too many people gave him a hard time for it. He was a huge, angry, and downright scary kid. During my first week in school, he'd already started to pick on me. He began calling me names and slurs, most of which I don't care to repeat. I wasn't used to being bullied, so I wasn't sure exactly how to respond. So, one day while he was antagonizing me and I'd had enough, I broke down and yelled out, "Yeah, well, at least my parents didn't name me Gaylord." Big mistake. The jackass jumped over his desk and began beating the living hell out of me. Fortunately for me, we were in math class, and the math teacher was also the wrestling coach, a fairly big man in his own right. He easily pulled Gaylord off of me. The bully got suspended from school for a month. It was no shock to me that he'd been suspended several times before, so his punishment this time was much more severe. I was more scared after the fight, though, than I'd ever been before it. I thought that he'd be so much more difficult to deal with after punishment, so I began to dread the end of the upcoming month. About a week after he'd gotten suspended, I went out hiking in the nearby park, which was basically a small forest off to the side of the town. I was still very new to the area and hadn't made many friends here yet. I think my altercation with that big bully didn't help me much. Who would want to be friends with someone who was likely to be the target of the biggest and scariest bully around? I was walking along, a bit lost in my thoughts. I was able to get my situation off my mind for the first time in a long while. I couldn't claim I was really enjoying myself, though. I heard some noises up ahead of me, and it sounded like some other kids were playing. I thought it might be nice to try and meet some new people and try to make some friends. I began to walk toward the direction of the commotion. When I finally caught sight of the person making the noise, though, I froze in fear, as I recognized it was Gaylord. I had only seen him from the back, though. He hadn't seen me yet. I realized that if I tried my best to be quiet, I could probably turn around and get away before he even knew I was there. The biggest tough luck moment of my life came at that moment, though. As if he had a sixth sense, he slowly turned around and his gaze met mine. The sickest, most psychotic look I'd ever seen on another human being's face flashed across his features. Terrified, I didn't wait for him to do anything. I turned immediately and began running. I knew that he had to be chasing me, but I tried not to think about it. I just ran. I tried not to think about what he would do if he caught me. I knew that it would be awful. Mid-step, I suddenly felt something hit me from behind. I knew it was him. I yelped and fell hard on the ground and severely bit my tongue. I found out later I'd nearly severed it. My mouth filled up with blood immediately. Gaylord took me, threw me on my back, and more blood began pouring out of my mouth. He began severely beating me. I put my hands up, but I could barely protect myself from this psychopath. He pounded me over and over. My head was growing fuzzy, and I knew that I was going to die. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was still laying in the forest, but it was completely dark, and nobody was there. Every part of me hurt, and my tongue felt like it was the size of a football. I was able to pull myself up to my feet and began trudging through the forest. It hurt for sure, but it wasn't nearly as scary as just walking around. I kept expecting him to jump out at me at every turn. I remember hearing an owl hoot and actually screamed a little, which of course hurt my tongue further. I didn't think I would make it through the forest, but after a bit of plowing on, I finally made it out. I went up to the first house I came to and knocked on the door. As the door opened, I freaked out. I completely expected to see him standing on the other side. I started crying. Luckily, it was a kind elderly woman who was shocked to see me there. I must have been quite the sight. I tried to tell her that I needed an ambulance, but because of my tongue, I couldn't actually talk. I didn't need to, though. It was quite obvious. She called 911. At the hospital, I learned how badly my tongue had been torn. It was being held on by only a thread of muscle. I had a broken cheekbone, a fractured skull, a concussion, a broken arm, and 3 broken ribs. I had to inform them through writing who it was that attacked me. He was arrested and spent the next 5 years of his life in juvenile hall. Well, at least he was sentenced to it. My parents moved out of town long before the 5 years were up. I don't look back at my bullying experiences as something that wasn't as bad as I remembered. It was as bad as I remembered, and for years I was terrified to be in the dark. I was terrified to go out into the woods. I was terrified to go to school, and terrified to be alone. He took a lot from me, and I wish he had nothing but the worst life. I quite like to go hiking in the area around where I grew up. Although I personally live in the city now, I still own the property where I was raised. Whenever I feel like I just need to get away from the world for a while, I drive out there for a weekend, grab my hiking gear, and just go exploring. I tend to always roam in the same areas. My trips were infrequent enough that I could explore the same area over and over again and still manage to find a new experience. I do recall one time, though, when I hiked a lot further than I ever had before. I can't remember for the life of me what exactly possessed me to do this. I had gotten an early start in the day, I suppose, and just decided to see if I could discover anything new. After a while, I came across a cave I had never seen before. I was a bit surprised, because it was a good-sized cave as well. It had a very large mouth, and almost looked like the sort of cave you'd see in a television show, or perhaps a cartoon. I'm not sure if I'm describing it well, but the entire point is that I could very easily just walk right into this cave. I didn't have to crawl in or find some crazy way. It was a bit wet with some puddles and such, but as I was wearing some very water-resistant hiking boots anyway, I didn't mind too much. I guess in retrospect, it might not have been a cave at all. It might have been some sort of abandoned mine. I really have no way of knowing for sure, so I decided to go ahead and try to explore a little bit. This cave had a very dank and humid feeling. There was also a really strong creepy factor to it. It almost felt like someone was watching me the entire time. I hadn't run into anyone at all while I was out hiking though, so I wasn't really concerned with that feeling that someone was watching me. I didn't believe there would be anyone in that cave anyway. I was surprised to find that it was actually really deep. I was able to walk further and further into it. The ceiling didn't decline in any dramatic way, but I could see a few stalactites. They weren't really big. I had to be careful to keep from bumping into them though. At one point, I turned around to check and see how deep I'd descended so far. I must have been about 50 feet from the door of the cave at that point. I made a mistake and kept walking as I was turned around looking toward the entrance. When I turned to face forward again, I'd nearly walked face first into one of the stalactites. I tried to catch myself, but as I did so, I lost my balance and fell face first into a puddle. I was a bit upset at my clumsiness, but luckily I hadn't gotten harmed in any way. Then though, as I began to pull myself out of that puzzle, I thought I heard the distinct sound of someone laughing. I shook my head, realizing I must have been hearing things, but as I listened closer, I began to hear it again. This time it was very clear and distinct. There was someone laughing at me, a single voice, giggling. Completely creeped out, I leapt to my feet and didn't even try to regain my composure. I hurried out of that cave as quickly as possible. The laughing continued from deep in the cave, but it got lighter as I rushed out to the entrance. The walk home was creepy as hell too. I mean, I didn't hear the laughing since I'd left the cave, but I could still feel I was being watched while out hiking. The memory of what happened followed me to my childhood home, and I had a difficult time sleeping in the house that night. I honestly didn't feel comfortable until I left my family home and returned to the city. You know, when it storms outside, I actually feel very comfortable. I know some people, and a lot of dogs as well, get very apprehensive, but not me. A storm comes on and I can nap or even sleep like a baby. I don't know why it's that way, but it's always just been comfortable for me. So, this story is going to be a bit weirder than you might normally hear. This happened when I was living in a small house that was not in the greatest neighborhood, I suppose. It was in a rural town in Tennessee. The biggest thing in town was a Walmart, and there were lots of fast food restaurants as well. I guess I lived more in the area where it was very cheap to get housing. This meant there were some unsavory people around. However, I had never really had any problems before. One of the things I hated was that the storms there were so wussy. I'm not sure what to call it other than that. I grew up in areas that had much more vicious storms in them, but there was almost never much of anything in that town. The one time I do remember having a severe storm also had an unexpected event happen as well. The storm came along in the afternoon, and it was pretty damn severe. I mean, dark, ominous green clouds, huge gusting winds, and tons of lightning as well. The coolest thing for me was how long the storm lasted. It went on into the evening, and eventually into the night as well. In fact, it was still going quite strong when I finally went to bed. Although I usually had some problems sleeping, I knew I would sleep like a baby during this storm. And I did. I fell right to sleep. It was when I got up in the morning that I had the shock of my life. My neighbor's house could be easily seen from my bedroom window. I saw it every morning when I woke up. But this time when I woke up and looked, it wasn't there at all. I got up and rushed over to the window. Peering outside, I became even more shocked. Their house was just a pile of rubble, and theirs wasn't the only one. Several other houses on that side of the street were all completely destroyed. There were power lines downed everywhere. There were broken trees strewn about, and even some overturned cars as well. Although I could guess what had happened, I didn't have it confirmed until a while afterward. A tornado had struck our neighborhood during the night. This wasn't my first experience with a tornado. I knew how loud and scary they were, but somehow I had slept peacefully through the entire experience. Also, by some miracle, my house had not been damaged almost at all. I lost some shingles and a single basement window was broken. I wasn't sure if it was from the pressure of the wind or the debris, but I did have the tree in my front yard broken in half as well. It was so frightening because I began thinking about what could have happened if that tornado had hit my house instead of all the others. I had obviously somehow slept through all the alarms. It was conceivable my house could have fallen in on me and killed me in my sleep, and I would have been none the wiser. I also could have been picked up by the tornado as well. I could have gone to sleep during the storm feeling nice and never woken up at all. Before you think I'm feeling sorry for myself though, at least no one was killed or seriously injured in the storm. Fortunately, everyone else had heard the alarms just fine and gotten to shelter in time. I don't really know when this clown thing started, and I don't really know what it's about either. All I know is that I had a really weird encounter, and just recently as well. I work at a fast food restaurant, you see. I work the closing shift all the time, and I myself don't have a car. My home is in an older neighborhood. My parents left me the house, so I own it outright. That's how I can afford to live in a house alone while only working a fast food job. One thing the job doesn't afford me though is a car, so I have to walk home every day after I get off work. On the night this happened, I got off from work around 1 o'clock in the morning. I then began to walk home. I live in a fairly small town, so of course it's rare that I come across much of anyone this late at night. It's usually a quiet and very peaceful walk home. When I turned onto my street though, I immediately noticed something very odd. Normally when I leave for work, since I know it will be really late when I get home, I always leave the porch light on for my house. But even though my house was much further down the street, I could already tell the light was off. Well, it could just be a burnt out bulb, right? I guess that should have been the first thing that came to my mind. It wasn't though. For some reason, I got nervous very quickly. My first thought was that somebody must have broken into my home. I began walking down the street rather cautiously. I kept to the sidewalk while straining my eyes to see what was happening. Then I noticed there seemed to be someone standing on my porch. Okay, so a burnt out bulb and someone standing on my porch. That was enough for me to get very worried. I took the side yard of one of my neighbors and walked over to the backyard of my immediate next door neighbor. Yes, I know how stupid that sounds. I should have just called the police. However, in the moment, that didn't occur to me. I just wanted to know who this could be. I was actually trying to think of a way to handle it myself. Plus, one of my immediate thoughts was that this must have been a friend of mine playing a really mean prank on me. It was not unheard of. If it was a friend and I called the cops on them, that would be a huge mess. I walked up to the side yard of my neighbor and peeked around the corner to see who this was. There, sitting on my porch, rocking back and forth in my dad's old rocking chair, was a clown. The shock I felt going through my body was indescribable, but the shock immediately turned to fear when I saw this clown was holding a large machete. Amid the fear, I still had the idea that this may have been one of my friends. We pranked back and forth, but this sort of prank was really bad. I decided the best thing to do was call the police, even if it was one of my buddies. Better to take the chance than end up dead. I quickly ducked back into the side yard. I called the police and told them there was a clown with a machete on my porch. This is when I found out about the recent clown sightings. The dispatcher didn't believe me at first and thought I was falsely reporting because of the popular trend. I insisted that was not the case though, so they sent out a car. I waited in the side yard for 20 minutes, waiting for the officers to arrive. It was 20 of the most terrifying minutes of my life. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of the car turning down the street. No siren though. As the cop car passed by my neighbor's house, I decided to come out and go over to my own. I felt safe finally. When I turned the corner, I noticed the clown was gone. My porch light was still out, but the clown was nowhere to be seen. I walked up and talked to the officer and explained what I'd seen. I don't think he believed me. He must have thought I made up the entire sighting. Still though, he checked the house out for me at my request. I guess it was just in case, and there was no clown in my house, luckily. I locked myself in the house when he left and closed all the blinds. I had to tell you, it was a long time before I felt comfortable at night again. That was the scariest night of my entire life. I've changed some small details here and there because I don't want this to get traced back to me. When this took place, I, female and in my 20s back then, was just finishing my degree in the city and working as a casual receptionist at a firm. One of the employees, Nick, told me one day that one of his clients, who he said was a stand-up guy, thought I was very cute and wanted to see if I would be okay to give him my number. We went to dinner and he was charming enough. He was in the medical field and about 7 years older. I didn't mind though, as my own parents had a similar age gap between them, and they turned out just fine. We talked about my studies, and he told me he thought my rather run-of-the-mill family life was quite amazing because his life had been so different. He was adopted as a baby, and his father was extremely abusive. When he was 15, his mother left, and he never saw her again after that. He was kicked out at 18 and ended up in a terrible car accident in his early 20s. For a long time, he stayed at a relative's house and worked hard to support himself. Yeah, pretty heavy conversation on the first date. But all I could feel was this overwhelming sense of compassion for this poor man who had been through so much. He was nice, smart, handsome, and though he was a tad too serious, given his life, I figured that was understandable. We ended up dating for a bit, but by the 3rd week, things started to feel a little bit weird. He refused to introduce me to any of his friends because his last ex had left him for a friend. He also hated that I had any male friends at all for the same reason. He would insist on reading any texts I sent or received from any male. I made excuses in my head for him, like, people need to heal, or sometimes they need a crutch before they can learn to trust. It's not like I have anything to hide. He started being very critical of the way I spoke, acted, and dressed. He was also super insistent we move in together right away, but I felt that was way too soon. In arguments, he would sometimes get this weird look in his eyes that made me feel extremely unsettled. I once tried to break the tension by half joking, "You look like you want to hit me or something," to which he responded this, "I wouldn't bother if it came to that. I would just kill you." I was so shocked I didn't even know how to react. Recounting it, red flags are everywhere obviously, but though it might be hard to believe, I was actually convinced I was falling in love with him. Most of the time he was perfect, until those times when he wasn't. He would always explain it away as being only because he had so many issues from his past, and I would believe him because I felt compassion for him. Then one day, I told him what I thought was a relatively funny story about a random guy in my class who asked for my number. The guy had asked under the guise of getting some notes for classes he'd missed. I only offered my college email address, explaining that I already had a boyfriend. Hilariously, as soon as class ended, I saw the guy look at the paper for a moment and hesitate, before throwing the paper I'd wrote my email on in the bin, on his way out of the lecture hall. I expected my boyfriend to laugh at this, but instead he lost it. He accused me of leading the man on and wanting to cheat on him. I was furious because I knew I'd done nothing wrong, when he angrily threw a mug at the wall which shattered. The whole argument came to an abrupt halt. I was scared and angry, so I grabbed my bag and bolted out the door. I thought he would try to stop me, but he didn't do anything. I went home and cried about it to my cousin, who I was living with at the time. I assumed it was now over. Days passed and I didn't hear anything from him. Within those days, I started to question everything. Suddenly, with some space away, it was clear as day that this relationship was toxic and very unhealthy. Even if he did have a tough past, it's not like it was my job to fix him, and it wasn't an excuse for the way he treated me either. I started to accept this was a horrible near miss, and I was about to get over it when he texted me, groveling in apologies about how much he missed me. I made the mistake of responding. He called and I picked up. It was because I wanted to tell him it was not going to work out. He cried and yelled at me though, and asked how I could do this to him. I knew that everyone he loved in his life had abandoned him. How could I do the same? He told me he would never be able to love again, and that it was all my fault. I had broken him. He told me he had given me everything, but I was leaving after such a small argument. He apologized and told me he was trying to change and to give him another chance. I was crying my eyes out. I felt like the worst human in the world, but I held my beliefs and said it was best we move on, and that I was sorry, but it needed to end here. He ended the call by telling me I had ruined his life. Nothing happened for a while, except some texts here and there where he would try to apologize, tell me he missed me, and then explain he realized he'd made so many mistakes. I would tell my cousin about him, and she would firmly tell me not to respond. She was sure he would go away eventually. A while later, though, on a day I'd finished work as usual, I was headed to the station. It was a busy day and the streets were scattered with other people. As I walked on, I had this weird sudden urge to look behind me. My head shot back, and I saw my ex. There was a small amount of distance between us, but as soon as I saw him, his eyes locked onto mine. He looked different, a bit out of it. I thought maybe he was drunk or something. I decided I would deal with him at the train station, as it would be more crowded, and I wanted to talk to him only in a place where there were lots of other people. I figured the yelling and crying would not be as intense that way. When I reached the station, he caught up to me. He stopped about 2 feet away, and I expected him to start apologizing again. Instead, he said nothing. He just stared at me with dead eyes. Awkward seconds passed, and I was about to tell him to leave me alone. I only got out a single word, though, because his arm moved slightly. He took his hand out of his pocket, and I saw he was holding a knife. I froze, and I vaguely remember thinking I wanted to run for it. It was like my brain and body shut down, though. I can only describe it as if there was a fog in my brain. I just couldn't move for what felt like ages. I stared at him. I still remember how his eyes looked so blank. I don't remember how long that lasted for. He took a step toward me, but then, without saying anything else, he turned and left swiftly. Nobody else seemed to have noticed. I remember numbly getting on the train. I started second-guessing if that had even happened. Hindsight tells me I must have been in shock. As soon as I got home, I burst into tears. My cousin calmed me down and helped me call the police. In the end, the security cameras were not placed in a spot that could clearly show he had a weapon, so the police couldn't do much. After that, I didn't see my ex again. I ended up quitting my job, changing my number, and moved away to another city. This story absolutely needs to be kept anonymous. I can't even tell you which state I live in, because even telling this story could get me in some serious trouble. I'm a psychiatrist who works in the psychiatric wing of a hospital. It can definitely be a trying job sometimes, but I really like to think that I can and do help people. Although it can be very draining, improving people's mental health is very rewarding. I'm not sure if you're familiar with United States HIPAA privacy laws, but they're extremely protective of an individual's right to privacy. This is especially so in the case of therapy. If someone were to admit something to a therapist, and they were specifically seeking out therapy for this problem, psychiatrists and psychologists are forbidden from relaying this information to the police, at least if there's not clear indication of future crimes. This has, in times, presented me with some pretty terrible admissions that I had to keep secret. The worst one was about 10 years ago. A new patient was admitted into the wing. He was in his late teens or so, thin, sallow, and very depressed looking. His mother had found him in his bedroom, cutting large slashes into his body with a straight razor. She had taken him to the hospital where the wounds were treated, and since he was found to be a danger to himself, they admitted him into my care. I'll call him Kyle, although that's definitely not his real name. I've dealt with a lot of people who've had some pretty severe psychological issues. Kyle, though, was a bit different. If I had to diagnose him, he was likely suffering from an extremely severe conduct personality disorder. Think the kind of teenager who kills small animals, for example. Very often, conduct disorder in a teenager will manifest itself into antisocial personality disorder as an adult. The technical term for this is what you'd call psychopathy. Anyway, Kyle didn't really cause many problems in the ward, although he didn't talk much at all either. This was unusual, because generally conversation was the most common activity amongst all patients. Instead, he would always just ignore everyone and sit and stare at the TV, regardless of what was on, or if it was on at all. When the TV time was over, he would go into his room, lay on his bed, and just stare at the ceiling. Kyle had been in the psychiatric wing for about 2 weeks. When I was talking to him about why he was cutting himself, the subject had come up several times before. He always avoided it. I, of course, needed to know what was going on, though, so I brought it up in every therapy session we had together. So the two of us were talking one day, and I really didn't expect to get any further with him than I ever had before. This time, though, when I asked Kyle why he'd been cutting himself, he suddenly and very quickly responded, "Because I wanted to see the way she felt when I cut her up in the same way." I was shocked. I asked him to elaborate. "If my mom hadn't stopped me, I would have known what she felt like when she bled to death." I asked Kyle what he was talking about. He didn't offer me any new information at all. He just repeated he had slashed some girl in the same way, and that she had painfully bled to death. He wanted to know how it felt himself. I couldn't tell if he was serious or not. I did some research, of course, and there didn't seem to be any recent murders or missing girls in the area. As far as I could figure, Kyle must have been lying. On the other hand, I couldn't discount the fact that he may have been admitting to a real murder. You see, Kyle was well aware that admitting to a crime, including murder, when seeking therapy in relation to that crime, prevents a doctor from contacting the authorities. I had no choice but to keep his secret, which may have been why he was so forthcoming with this story and told me that. The first thing that went through my mind was that if this kid really killed someone, he and I would be the only two people to ever know. In actuality, I can't really tell if he was making the story up. Maybe he was. He probably got annoyed at me that I kept asking him why he was cutting himself. He was that sort of kid. He was dark for the sake of being dark. But there was something about him that wouldn't stop me from being scared to death of this kid. Thankfully, it allowed me to keep him longer in the psychiatric ward for as long as I deemed necessary to protect others from him. I never could find out if he really murdered anyone, and he never mentioned it again. But I kept him under strict observation for a very long time. One of my favorite pastimes is finding and exploring caves. It's generally pretty fun for several reasons. It's interesting to find areas that might not have ever been seen by anyone else. Sometimes the caves can be very creepy as well, and I have to admit that the dangerous aspect of exploring is pretty exciting too. I'm not going to mention exactly where this happened, though I will mention that we do have a lot of caves in the general area, so it's easy to stumble upon them. I really don't want someone to read this and think that cave exploring is a good idea, then run off and get themselves lost, hurt, or even worse, and blame me for it. A few years back, when I was out exploring, I was climbing up the side of a pretty large hill. I noticed some strange rock formations that led me to believe there might be an opening for a cave. As I searched around, I found what I was looking for, and now I was pretty excited. The cave's entrance was rather short, however. There was no way I could get into it by walking. I would have to get onto my belly and crawl inside. This is actually pretty common, though of course there's no real guarantee the ceiling will rise, nor that there will be any sort of tunnel or compartment once I got in there. Half the fun, though, is finding that out. So, I got down on my belly and slipped myself into the cave. It was dirty and a bit wet, but hey, that's cave exploring for you. I quickly moved through it. I was able to move pretty quickly, because although the ceiling was low, it wasn't so narrow that I couldn't crawl at all. After a few minutes, I came to the end of the tunnel. There seemed to be a compartment at the very end. I reached over for my flashlight. I wanted to shine it into the cave to see what I was dealing with before stepping in. As my hand fumbled for it though, I heard something that gives me chills to this very day. I heard a distinct voice call out from deeper inside the cave. "Get out of here right now, or else." I jerked and hit my head on the ceiling. I dropped my flashlight as a flash of pain shot through my body. Fortunately, although I was hurting, I'd not been knocked senseless. There was someone in that cave, and they did not want me there. I was going to leave. I scrambled on my belly, hands and knees, to reverse out of that cave as quickly as I could. It wasn't easy, and it took me many minutes. With each moment, each crawl forward, I expected someone to reach out and grab my ankle and start pulling me from behind. I expected whoever that man was to attack me and pull me back into the cave. I was pretty scared shitless, of course, but I made it out just fine, without my flashlight. I didn't care too much for that loss, though. I got up and ran far away. I don't know why someone would be hanging out in a random cave like that. Maybe some weird drug dealers making some illegal drugs, or something worse. I'm glad I didn't have to find out, though, and that's another reason I don't recommend doing this on your own. Trust me, you don't want to find out who someone like that is either. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.